What's up guys, Jay's 2 cents here, and today's video is going to be a little bit beginner level. So if you're one of my more advanced followers, feel free to come back in the next one or just hang around if you want. You might actually learn something, or you might even just laugh at me like you guys already do. It's okay, I don't mind. I'm used to it. The wife laughs at me all the time. Today we're going to talk about overclocking and whether or not it's safe, because I feel like there's a lot of people out there that are not using their hardware to its full potential because they're afraid of something because of a lot of misinformation that is out there in the world. Things have gotten better when it comes to overclocking and people generally accepting it. And hopefully by the end of today's video, you'll be one of those people as well. Now the first thing you have to understand is what exactly overclocking is, and that's simply increasing either the multiplier or the frequency of your component, whether it be graphics card or CPU or even memory, to get more operations per second to make it operate faster. Now that might have already thrown some people out. Just basically think about it this way. It's like putting the gas pedal down farther on your car. Let's say your car had a screw that stopped the gas pedal from going any farther than that. Overclocking is you backing that screw off so that you don't, but you're gonna allow that gas pedal to go down even farther because, well, from the factory, they're actually built to go much faster than they ship, which means you've got a lot of headroom and free horsepower just sitting there waiting to be tapped. Well, Jay, if the chips could go faster, then why don't the companies just ship them at their max speed already? Well, I'm glad you asked that, because you have to understand how many units are actually built and shipped. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of video cards over the last several years and millions of processors shipped over the last, let's just say the last decade, right? Millions and millions of processors and graphics cards and memory modules and all of that stuff. Well, you have to think about the RMA, or Return Merchandise Authorization, and warranties that are involved with that. Whereas a huge number of those parts can actually well exceed the factory clocks that they're being shipped at. They have to think about the failure rate, and these companies like Intel and AMD and Nvidia have to make sure they can keep good yields, because if they're shipping these things literally at the limit and they're breaking left and right and they're taking back these warranty returns and having to ship more, then they're just losing money. So what they've decided to do over the last, I'd say over the last 5 or 6 years, it's gotten really good, maybe farther, maybe more like 7 years, where these companies have really started to relax the locked functions of these CPUs and graphics cards now to allow you, if you want to take the risk, and they're very adamant about it being a risk, you can play around with your components and get more speed if you want. But on AMD now, you've got the Black Edition, which has unlocked voltage and front side bus multiplier. You can play around with all that stuff. Intel now has the K SKU, and they even sell an additional warranty. So if you blow up your processor due to overclocking it, you get another one, very, very inexpensive. And Nvidia and AMD both on the graphics card sides have really started to implement good headroom on the amount of additional power target and voltage and stuff that you can work with, again, to try and get better performance at the trade-off of higher heat and potentially degrading the lifespan of the product. Now, I think that's one of the things that scares people, is they hear about degradation or degrading of the chip, and they think, oh my God, if I overclock this, every time I turn on my computer, I'm literally just degrading it, I'm shaving life off of it. And whereas that might be true, what you're actually doing is you're shaving it off, obviously, the tail end of its lifespan, and you might have turned a chip that would run otherwise 10 or 15 years and made it maybe run 7 or 8 years before it dies. Are you planning on upgrading before you potentially hit that lifespan? I'm going to use an example here of an Intel E6300. It was a Core 2 Duo chip. It was clocked at 1.86 gigahertz, and it was unlocked. I overclocked mine to 3.42 gigahertz. That was an 80% overclock. And I've still, to this day, never had a chip of any type that has achieved that level of overclocking. That was like Intel's pinnacle of overclocking, and they've never been able to get anything that overclocked nearly as far. But the reason why I'm even mentioning this is that CPU ran at 3.42, 24/7, no thermal or no turbo clock. It just ran. You turned it on, it went to 3.42, and it never came down. None of that power balancing crap, none of the C states or any of that. And that CPU lasted over 7 years. And the reason why I say this, the CPU lasted, was because it was actually the motherboard that died. It was an old LGA 775 socket, and it just wasn't worth replacing by the time it died. So the CPU was still working actually after 7 years and spending every day of its life overclocked to that speed with a lot more voltage going in it than what was ever shipped from the factory. Now that's an example of a great silicon lottery winner where you get a chip that overclocks really, really well. On the flip side, the lottery loser would be the chip that no matter how much voltage you give it, no matter how much you try and tweak the multiplier or the core or the base clock, just won't overclock. And that is, you have no control over that. You either got a great one or you didn't. Sometimes you can find one in the middle. Most of us have one somewhere in the middle ground, but you always end up hearing about those people on forums that just flat out lost the silicon lottery, and you kind of feel bad for them. And then you all kind of hate the guy that just absolutely won the silicon lottery and has the magical chip that will go to like 5 gigahertz plus with hardly any extra voltage. And we all love to hate that guy, trust me. So when you overclock, yeah, you're shaving off some of the lifespan, but you have to ask yourself when you're planning on upgrading. If you are on a schedule and you upgrade your computer every 3 years, or you buy a graphics card every other year, you're not going to shave off enough life to even notice any sort of degradation in the span of which you've owned that card or that CPU. And the telltale sign of degradation is where your clocks are no longer stable anymore at that overclock and you have to start bumping it down. And as you decrease it, you start to decrease some of the load, or again, degradation, and it pushes it back out again. So it's just a balancing act. Now the number one killer of overclock components, believe it or not, has nothing to do with the clock speed. It has everything to do with the voltage and exponential heat that's going to occur when you start to add voltage and overclocking to your parts. Now a lot of people think it's linear. You add X amount of voltage, the temperature is going to go up on a straight line. It doesn't work that way. Some chips, in fact most chips, a little bit of voltage can be a sudden spike in temperature where, let's just use for example, a 6700K at 1.3 volts. That's kind of high, that's starting to get kind of high on Intel. And it might be running at, let's say, 75 C under load on a basic water, like all-in-one water cooling loop. And then you bump it up to, let's say, 1.325, which is just 0.250 of a volt. And suddenly it jumps up to 85 C, 10 C jump for just a little bit of voltage. And what you'll find is as you start to reach the limits of the CPU, the voltage goes, the voltage jumps will give you much bigger steps of temperature increase. And the whole reason I'm even mentioning this is that means you obviously have to keep the temperatures in check. So obviously the point here is to get the best results with overclocking your CPU, you need to have a really good cooler, whether that be like a Noctua ND14 or some sort of a 120 millimeter or 240 millimeter water cooling loop, something that's going to give you better than factory cooling. Factory heat sinks that come with Intel and AMD are garbage, literally paperweights that just belong in the trash if you think you're going to overclock. It's not going to happen with those. So you need more headroom when it comes to cooling. Heat, again, I'm going to repeat this, is the #1 killer of components, even stuff that isn't overclocked. Factory CPU coolers are terrible even at factory clocks, and I think everybody should be running some sort of a custom cooler. Everyone should have a dual loop skunkworks in their system as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think you should have to pay for it. I think the world should just give it to you. But I think another thing that makes people kind of fearful of whether or not overclocking is safe is in order to find your max overclock, often you're going to find that point of failure, and it's that failure point that scares people. You've moved that slider on your afterburner in your video card, and suddenly you went to launch your game and it completely froze up. No mouse, no keyboard, nothing working. You restart the computer, you start your game, and again it freezes and you start to freak out a little bit. So you wipe the profile and you go, I don't want to overclock, that's scary. Or with your CPU, you push your overclock a little bit too far. You start up your computer, it clicks on and then it clicks off and it just starts power cycling and won't go. And you're like, oh my God, what did I do? I think I broke it. I broke my computer. My mom is going to kill me. Well, CPUs are a little bit more tricky to overclock, and fortunately the clear CMOS button on there is going to wipe any of your settings that you may have messed up, and it's going to get you up and running again. But you need to be more careful with CPUs than GPU, because CPU perimeters are not going to have very many safeguards involved to keep you from blowing it up. If you try and boot an X99 chip here like my 5960X and you dial in 2.5 volts, it's possibly going to actually let it boot, and then it's just going to fry the CPU because that is way more voltage than it's designed to handle. And you're getting into like LN2 liquid nitrogen cooling territory there. But the motherboards aren't going to keep you from making that mistake. Graphics cards, on the other hand, overclock them, move those sliders, have some fun, because those sliders are set by the BIOS on how far they can actually go. And those BIOS limits are set by the factory on where they know it's safe to play around with. It's safe to move that voltage slider all the way to the right. It's safe to put that temperature limit all the way to the right. Hopefully you have an aftermarket card which is not going to have terrible fans on it like blower style coolers from the factories, and they have nice big huge heat pipe heat sinks that are going to keep things nice and cool. But bottom line here, guys, is you have to try pretty hard to actually break something when it comes to your overclocks and your CPUs. Even when I was learning, I never broke anything. It was always revertible. I'm not even sure that's a word. It could always be reverted and start over. But the bottom line is, even a mild overclock, just a small overclock, 5%, 10%, is that much more power and that much more performance you're getting for the same amount of money. And you're missing out if you're not taking that opportunity to pull more power out of your components. The nice thing about overclocking, though, is typically on graphics cards, the percentage of overclock usually directly relates to the percentage of performance increase. So if you get a 15% overclock on your graphics card, you can get about a 15% extra boost in frames per second. It's kind of weird that it works out fairly linear like that. Of course, it's going to deviate from that line a little bit, but it's pretty close. It's actually a pretty amazing thing. So if you have a great graphics card that overclocks and you can get 25 extra percentage of frequency out of it, you're going to get anywhere between 20 and 25% extra FPS. So what are you waiting for? Do it. But with that said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. I hope this video has helped put you at ease just a little bit. We will do more overclocking tutorials here on the more modern stuff, X99. We'll check out some Skylake overclocking, and I've been promising that one forever. And I promise more Red Mist videos are coming. I want the build done. I want it out of here. I was just waiting on parts, and then I got really busy, and then I went to Austin, and everything got just completely foobarred. But we're going to get back on track. We're going to get that build finished and the hell out of my shop. All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and follow on Twitter and all that. This video is sponsored by MassDrop, the largest community commerce platform in the world. And right now, they have a massive drop on the popular AKG K7XX MassDrop Edition audio file